welcome to Conservatives for Ukraine, our latest webinar. We're going to discuss the issue today, why Ukraine must win. But I think there's also a sub-question to that, is can Ukraine win? And there's a lot of controversy about that at the moment. We're hearing stories of Russian advances and that the obviously Ukraine has been starved of weaponry over recent months, and this will obviously affect morale. We're hearing of Russian advances in Avdiivka, but then we hear contradictory reports say that the defense is standing strong. We're even hearing reports of possible foreign troops, NATO troops already in Ukraine. And I don't know whether these are true or not, but I think we need to make it very clear why Ukraine must win, but also how Ukraine must win, how Ukraine can be helped to win even at this late juncture, and the positive implications of Ukraine winning. What implications will it have for Russia? Maybe that will improve Russia. What implications will it have with China, with Iran, with other nations that are threatening world peace and stability? So I thought I'd throw it open. I'll start with our friend Lauren Morris. If you could give us just your 5 or 6 minute take on why Ukraine must win and how Ukraine should be helped to win.
Sure. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Well, as some of you know, I went to Ukraine a year ago in 2023. And because I wanted to see and hear for myself, and I had the opportunity to go, and I went, and I wanted to bring back the message for the American people from the average Ukrainian person, from the NGOs, and anybody that I could talk there. And basically, there are 3 points that the Ukrainian people, that is important to the Ukrainian people, that I think, aside from what we see in Zelensky's messages every night and what's going on with the soldiers and the battlefields and the battlefield and the weapons, is that victory, number one, victory is the only thing that is acceptable to Ukraine, because preserving their land, their people, their resources, which we know about, their food and the rich resources that they have, their culture, their beautiful artistic culture, their people, and their right to self-governance is their fundamental goal. Number two is that the Ukrainians want us to understand that right now is the time for the world to decide whether or not they're going to be ruled by tyrants, or whether, and that now is the time for all of us to unite together and to make a stand against Putin and his allies for the rule of Ukraine and the horizontal spread of a greater war into Europe. So that's a fundamental narrative for them. Now is the time for us to decide whether or not we are going to be ruled by tyrants. They cannot be contained. They must be defeated. And then number three, which I think is the most important, and I will kind of scoot off into a little sidebar here, is that the Ukrainian spirit will not be broken and cannot be broken. And this is a major main narrative that they are all putting out right now. You will not break us. And I think that this is really an important narrative. So aside from the war spreading, aside from the geopolitics of everything, for me, it comes down to a people who are being ethnically cleansed and genocided. And they're a beautiful people. They're an intelligent people, and they are not worth being thrown away. And so I wanted to make the comment about Anthony Blinken playing guitar on stage in Ukraine. And first of all, I want to say that I'm sure that for him, that was not something he wanted to do or even planned on doing. He probably found himself in that situation. It was probably a frightening situation and nothing that he wanted to do. And so I think the criticism against him is kind of a trivial matter, because I think what he was showing that the Ukrainian spirit cannot be broken, and he was joining in that regard. And that's how I see that situation. So, other people might want to weigh in as to whether or not that was an appropriate or inappropriate thing for somebody like him to do. But I do believe that it was about the Ukrainian people, and it's all hands on deck over there. And one of the things that they told me when I was over there was that it was enough for them, for the average Ukrainian citizen, for Americans and the rest of the West and Western democracy, just to know that we care about them and we care about everything that I said that is important to them as a people. This is why Ukraine must win. It will be a disaster if we lose them to Russia and let Vladimir Putin be in control of them, their knowledge, their technology, and everything that they have to offer to the world. And that's what I have to say about that, Trevor.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for making the effort to go there and talking on the ground. That is a very valuable testimony. Now, Jeff, um, you're a strategist, you're a historian. You're from your historical perspective, from your strategic perspective. Lauren talked about losing Ukraine would be a disaster for the West, well, for the Ukrainians and for everyone else. How can you amplify that message? Why is it so important for us that Ukraine wins, and how can they do this?
People claim that NATO's been trying to surround Russia when the Baltic states make up 11% of Russia's border. And it was only out of fear because of the invasion of Ukraine that Finland has joined and doubled that to 20, I think it's 22% of the Russian border is now NATO. So that's not exactly an encirclement to have 22% shared border with Russia. But on the other hand, Russia has maintained its communist bloc alliances with countries like Cuba. It's helping Nicaragua. It has troops in Venezuela. There is an attempt by Russia and China to surround and subvert the United States and NATO. And China is particularly important in viewing the war in Ukraine because China and Russia, as we see with Putin's trip to Beijing, they are together. And however you want to frame the alliance, I think it is really a military alliance. They've had joint military exercises. I think they have ambitions. They've worked things out. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is their baby. And I think it's an aggressive organization. And both of them are feeding North Korea and Iran. And we have a prospective war in the Middle East to add on to this. So they're in the Western Hemisphere, they're in the Middle East, they're in the Far East, and they're partners. And so this partnership, they described it before Putin invaded Ukraine, they described their partnership as the most powerful combination since World War II. And I think it is. And so we're not dealing with the Soviet threat, we're dealing with a much larger threat today with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and their other partners. I think then we realize how serious it is. And then we have the problem that the West is behind in military modernization of its nuclear forces, of its missiles. And we've had more than half of our ICBM tests fail over the last 5 years. We don't have any new nuclear warheads since the Cold War ended. We merely refurbished the ones we have, and everything's reaching the end of its shelf life. And we're not going to have new weapons until new nuclear weapons until 2029. Well, some people say we're rushing it. Maybe we'll have them later this year. That's yet to be seen, but we're behind them and the Chinese are mass producing nuclear weapons. We don't know how many. And I think that this front in Ukraine, they are so emboldened by their newfound strength or what they perceive it as it is. They've done this big offensive against Ukraine, and it's only the beginning. And so we have a lot to lose here because if the former borders of the Soviet Union are restored, then we have the Soviet Union and China together effectively and threatening NATO. Then, you talk about more border with NATO. If Russia's afraid of NATO, if they take over Ukraine, they're going to have a bigger border with NATO. And I think NATO is being undermined by the Chinese. America is being economically undermined by China. So, I mean, every little bit helps, right? And Ukraine's an important country. It's the largest country in Europe aside from Russia. And I think its security and survival is absolutely vital to our survival.
Okay, I can't agree more, Jeff. Uh, so, Thomas, you're a journalist. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. You've traveled to Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Bloc countries over a long period of time. You've written a book, which I hope people will look up on Amazon. Why Ukraine Must Win, Thomas Cromwell. So, give us a synopsis, please, Thomas. Why, in your view, must Ukraine win? Is it purely a moral thing? Is it a geopolitical thing, or a combination of both?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's definitely a combination of both. Sort of continuing from what Jeff was saying, I think that's a very good global perspective that we need to keep in mind. I mean, I think it doesn't take much deep analysis to realize that if Ukraine is overrun by Russia, that the threat to Europe is exponentially increased. And so there's just no way that we can allow Russia to just keep part of Ukraine, not any of it, as part of its global ambition. I think Putin revealed his hand when in February 21st, in his national address to Russia, 3 days before the invasion in 2022, he laid out his real agenda and his real mindset. He's not only trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union, he believed that Lenin and the Bolsheviks made a big mistake when they established the Soviet Union and gave a degree of autonomy to the constituent states, the 15 Soviet socialist states, including Ukraine. He believed that was a huge mistake that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1990, 1991. So he's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire, and its borders is sort of his first goal. But I think we also need to look at it in the context. This is what my book really does, in the context of the Cold War history and the problem generated by George Kennan's theory of containment. Kennan was a big Russophile. He said he was never happier than when he visited the home of Tolstoy in Russia. And his policy was one that was based on the idea that we could not defeat communism. We should therefore just contain it. And he also had a sort of mystical belief that it may just fade away due to its internal weaknesses. The Kennanites believed that he was right when the Soviet Union collapsed, but it was also a naive belief. And it led, of course, to the theory of the Truman Doctrine, which first came home to roost in Korea, when the generals in Korea, MacArthur and later Clark, believed absolutely that they could take North Korea back, especially if they had permission to bomb the bridges over the Yalu River and the sanctuaries for North Korea in China. But Truman refused that permission, and later Ike supported Truman's position. So they ended up negotiating the armistice, which is being enforced to this day. And it's always done in the name of saving lives and saving treasure. But think about how many lives have been lost because of that, how much suffering has continued in North Korea, and even for the West to maintain that huge American presence in South Korea all these years, and the destabilization and what that's cost. So that was containment theory in practice in Korea, repeated in Vietnam. And I think the message of World War II compared to World War I, which Victor Davis Hanson always talks about, is that in World War II, Germany and Japan were both forced to surrender totally. And they were occupied by the Allies to make sure that the surrender would stick. And because of that, both Germany and Japan were transformed as nations. You know, people say people and nations cannot be changed, but it's undeniable that Japan and Germany today are no longer aggressors, no longer enemies of the civilized world. So I think that's the message for Ukraine as well. We don't want containment in Ukraine. As Lauren said, we need victory in Ukraine. The problem is a lack of will, a lack of moral clarity in the West, starting in the Oval Office in Washington. So, ironically, the Democrats have been generally better than many Republicans in supporting Ukraine. But it's a lukewarm support, it's a late support, it's a weak support, it's an equivocal support. And that's why the Russians have made all this progress. It's amazing what Ukraine has done given that equivocation. And again, as Lauren says, I think the spirit of the Ukrainians is very, very important. We have to get behind them. I think lastly, I would refer to Generals Breedlove, Philip Breedlove, and I always forget his name, it slips my mind. It'll come back to me. There are a few generals who really have the issue. They understand it right. They understand that Putin's just blackmailing using the threat of World War III or nuclear weapons. It's the only big tool he has, and the Russians themselves used it in the Cold War. We shouldn't be intimidated by that. We shouldn't be intimidated by this argument that we're escalating the war. How can you escalate a war in which the enemy is using all of its resources short of nuclear weapons? And why are we prohibiting the Ukrainians from attacking targets in Russia? Only now, after 2 years, over 2 years, is that silly restriction being slowly removed. Why did it take this long to provide F-16s, to provide attacker missiles that they need to target the sanctuary of Russia in its own territory? So these are all considered. Ben Hodges is the other general, sorry.
Yeah.
I think it's not that complicated. The beginning of the road to victory is a determination to win.
Yep, I agree. And if there is no clear, in World War II, there was a very clear goal, wasn't it? To defeat Nazi Germany, to defeat Japan, to defeat fascist Italy. There was never talk of containment. Never. It had to be defeated, and the country, the West, mobilized to do that. And I think, given that same mobilization again, we can defeat this latest threat. But what's your opinion, Victor?
Escalation, by the way, Trevor. Nobody spoke about we can't escalate the war with Hitler. Are you kidding?
Yeah, look, exactly. It's a farcical argument, but it's a tragic argument that it's leading to a lot of unnecessary deaths and a lot of delaying what should be a certain victory for the West here. Victor? You've got a lot of contacts in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine. Why, in your opinion, must Ukraine win, and how do we need to make that more possible given the current circumstances?
Well, a tough issue to address in 5 minutes. I think minimally, let's address the core issue of what this is all about or what it is not about. And this is not a real estate dispute. Let's make that clear. You would think it's clear, but it isn't, particularly for people in Congress, and unfortunately for too many people in the Republican Party. Russia, as I've said many, many times before, is the largest country in the world. It's got a border that would stretch around the equator, around the globe, 1.5 times. It occupies a third of Asia. And with Gaza and Hamas in the news, by point of comparison, Russia is 40,000 times larger than the Gaza Strip. The issue for us ultimately boils down to global, in my estimation, global deterrence credibility. Ukraine's, in one respect, is not unique. We have an internationally recognized country. If you try to compare it with Taiwan, where we have a lot of concerns, obviously, Taiwan is not. International law does not apply to Taiwan. So what happens to our credibility with our allies and our enemies if we fail in Ukraine, and yet we try to be taken seriously when it comes to Taiwan? We stripped Ukraine of its nuclear weaponry. Well, what about I'm trying to turn this off, I apologize, of its nuclear weaponry? There goes nuclear disarmament. If you want to know what will happen if we throw Ukraine under the bus, well, it already happened. We have a glaring precedent 100 years ago of the same thing happening. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine warned the West and contracted and paid for arms from the United States, surplus arms. We reneged. We walked away. Ukraine's warnings were ignored. Ukraine was occupied and ruled out of Moscow for generations until 1991. And what happened in the interim? You know, we were at the brink of cataclysm several times. We have the phenomenon now of essentially, in many respects, losing the very notion of mutual deterrence. We now have submission to Putin's unilateral nuclear blackmail or intimidation. Take that and extrapolate it out to China or any other country that has nuclear arms. And if you play it out to its logical or illogical conclusion, you would have to say that a nuclear country can do whatever it wants to a country that does not have a nuclear defensive capability and do whatever it wants. And that is a recipe for disaster. We simply have not engaged in a sufficiently critical self-assessment, assessing of how in the world we got to where we are now from where we were 30 years ago when the Soviet Union imploded, and it imploded definitively because Ukraine declared independence, and without Ukraine, no further Soviet Union or some other reconstituted empire would be possible. Well, where were we then? Number one in the world, the only superpower. Where are we today? What happened to our friends? And look at what has happened with the multiplication of our enemies. And let's stay away from nomenclature such as adversaries or competitors. We are talking about self-declared enemies, of the United States and of what we call the West and of what we sacrificed for in World War II. That is what we have in the balance. We have the whole moral question. We have, unfortunately, a very bitter record of betrayal in the past in Ukraine. Ukraine has a population that is 25% of where it should be if you compare any other country in Europe. 25%. And where did the other 75% go? Well, they were vaporized in World War II and living under Soviet Russian rule. And it's happening again. We said it'll never happen again. Well, Putin is saying, well, you just sit tight and you watch me do it all over again. So we have what seems like an easy question to answer, which is, are we going to get serious about this or not? But we have a very serious problem in getting our act together and demonstrating and implementing that willpower, because we've been undercut by Russian disinformation, a term that has many, many implications. And you can see what is happening on the Hill. You can see the usurpation of the far right of the Republican Party, the party of President Reagan. And you can only marvel at the ability of Putin to do what Russia has been doing for centuries, gutting and undermining societies that were their target for future control and future rule. If we don't get serious about it and assess how we got to where we are right now, the future looks very, very grim. Herding cats with Europe, that's another problem. But Europe is starting to get its act together a little bit better than the United States. And if we don't shake off this self-deterrence, and if we don't get out from underneath this unilateral submission to nuclear blackmail and allow Ukraine to do what any country has a right to do to defend itself. Look at Israel. Israel is not saying they're not going to attack their enemies outside of their borders. That would be moronic. That's lunacy. That is hardly strategic acumen in practice. We have that in Ukraine. And it's coming, unfortunately, from advisors in our foreign policy establishment who have made grievous errors in the past and continue to make those errors and continue pressing on the limitations on Ukraine's use of American weaponry and technology. There are no restrictions on American technology being incorporated in Russian weaponry, North Korean, Iranian, or Chinese. And you open up the little black box of missile strikes into Ukraine, and it is chock full of Silicon Valley. No restrictions on the other side, restrictions on Ukraine. This is going to go down in history as just stupid. There is no other way, no other word to describe it. And it will inure to our tragic disadvantage along the lines of what everybody else has said already.
Well, thank you, Victor. Well, I think there is another word for it, actually. It's called treason. But we can leave that
That's
to
about
one
my
side.
subject.
We attribute quite often stupidity to things that are actually deliberate. And I think it's fair to say that there are, just as there is a lot of propaganda directed at the conservative movement in this country, there is also a lot of infiltration of enemy agents in this country who will work to the benefit of our enemies. We've seen that in every other war. I don't see why it wouldn't be happening now, and I think there's a lot of evidence that there is. So, Lauren, let's talk a little bit before we
Trevor,
take questions.
excuse me. May I interrupt here, because we're going to get lost in some of the other stuff. I think it's very important to make a following point. If people doubt the effectiveness of Russian disinformation in Western and particularly American society, all I have to do is present you with an example. Let us say that Russia in 2014, and even more so in 22, invaded and annexed Sicily, or England, France, Germany, any of the quote unquote what we consider to be European countries. And let's forget about, for the moment, that they are members of NATO. I can tell you with a certainty that our reaction would have been far, far different than the reaction we have seen vis-a-vis Ukraine. And the reason is that there is still this notion that, okay, Ukraine is an independent country, it's a founding member of NATO, but somehow it is or was a quote unquote part of Russia. And therefore, Russia has some colorable claim. And that is a propaganda line, a construction, reconstruction of history that was done still under Tsarist imperial rule and imperial Russian historians, which took root here in the West a century ago, and it has permeated our educational system, our media, our politicians, our way of thinking and looking at Ukraine. Ukraine is not France. If it was in our mental picture, we would never have seen developing what we see developing in Ukraine going back to 2014. And that is for you the biggest, the most pervasive, and I would say the single most consequential example of how deeply Russian disinformation has penetrated our psyche, both our consciousness and our subconscious.
Yes, I agree very much, Victor. I joke, but it's only half joking, that the three most common elements in Earth's atmosphere are oxygen, nitrogen, and Russian propaganda. It is ubiquitous. It is coming through QAnon. It is coming through people like Tucker Carlson. It's coming through the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. It's coming through the European right. It's coming from the left. It's all over. Let's talk a little bit about Russian propaganda, and then how Ukraine can win, and we'll take a few questions. So let's everybody weigh in a little bit on Russian propaganda. Lauren, you've seen a little bit of this up close. What's the most pervasive Russian propaganda memes that you see, and where is it coming from?
I like to say that, it really is like Inquirer level gossip rag trash. And the ones that permeated the most, that are still kind of hanging around, have to do with what Ukraine is doing with the money. There's no oversight. The money's being laundered. Zelensky and everyone are just, pawns for Biden. And there's just a corruption that they can't clean out. And and then it goes on from there. Those narratives have never stopped. I think that a lot of people that jumped on those narratives, like Bannon and his ilk, they really thought that the war was going to be over in less than a month. And here we are hundreds of days later, and what are they going to say now? They can't back down. They will refuse to change their course and admit that they were wrong. And we have Alex Jones and his InfoWars company piling on. And Marjorie Taylor Greene has been the cheerleader out there leading the charge. And the last time I saw her talk about Ukraine, I thought to myself, she's just an idiot savant who has just strung together a group of narratives. She has no clue what she's talking about. And in the meantime, you have what's happening now with Alex Jones, besides going on Russian state, TV with those crazies over there, coming out and telling everybody, we're the Christians. We are the ones that you should follow. We are the only ones with the truth. In the meantime, they're literally calling for the genocide of the Ukrainian people. And it couldn't be more disgusting to me. Jack Posobiec is one of the worst. And you can see, if you look at his Telegram channel, his numbers are very small, by the way, but all of the people that follow him, they're Russian people, all calling for the genocide of Ukraine. I would not want that to be my audience if I was a Christian. So that's what I see happening.
Okay. Jeff, the propaganda war, how do you see it playing out? Where's it coming from? How can it be countered?
Well, it's coming from Russia, of course. On the NATO website, they actually, because they're so harassed, and I can testify to this because I'm on American radio, talk radio, and I'm on shows that take callers, conservative callers. And these are what I hear over and over again. And this is directly from the NATO website of Russian disinformation about the war, that NATO is at war with Russia. We just had last weekend a guy associated with the Center for Security Policy wrote a piece in the South, what was it, that Hong Kong paper, the South China
Post,
Morning Post, or whatever it is, and it was saying that there were French troops, French Foreign Legion Regiment in Ukraine. Well, the guy's credible. The guy's a former Undersecretary of Defense, but it turns out it's not credible. So this myth that NATO was at war with Russia and Ukraine, that's one of them. The other one is that NATO promised Russia it would not expand after the Cold War. Nations make promises and alliances make promises in the form of treaty. There was never such an agreement made. It was an offhand remark by Baker suggesting that they make such an agreement, but Gorbachev did not take him up on it. The other myth that NATO's an aggressive alliance, no, NATO is a defensive alliance. Another one is that NATO's deployments are a threat to Russia. NATO didn't start forward deploying, and its forward deployments are really a joke compared to what would be needed to actually defend the Baltic states. But the only countries that have joined in NATO, Russia, are the three Baltic state countries, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And the fact is, those deployments the larger deployments only started after the war in Ukraine began. And then NATO's encircling Russia. Look, I said this before, NATO only has 11% of Russia's border is NATO countries. And now Finland joined NATO out of fear of Russian aggression, so it's doubled that amount. 22% of a country's border is not an encirclement. And then, of course, the myth is that NATO's out of area operations prove that the alliance is not offensive, and they're talking about Afghanistan there, and that's ridiculous. We know what happened in Afghanistan. So anyway, so you just debunk it all. But you will hear this in the mouth of conservative call-in people. Just the other day, this week, somebody called in and said there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine if it wasn't for Victoria Nuland. They're referring to the Victoria Nuland conversation with Ambassador Piot, which has nothing to do with overthrowing Ukraine. So it's just people have this Russian propaganda in their heads, and it's a fact.
Well,
Jeff, what would your call-in audience say, or how would they react if you told them that Ukraine made America great again in 1991?
They might be offended by that, because
they wouldn't know what you're talking about, right?
No, they would not know what I'm talking about. They wouldn't know the fact that Ukraine's standing up for their own freedom has made an America that was growing weaker into a position from going to a position that was eroding to a position that we can actually contain Russia and China. And of course, I agree with what was said about containment. I think containment hasn't been a successful policy in the past. So, yeah, no, they wouldn't understand good point.
Well, I want to get back to that in a minute, Victor. I want to get Thomas's comments on propaganda and then Claire's. And then, Victor, if you will talk about that, how Ukraine has actually made America stronger, made America greater, because I think it is a great point that is missed by most commentators and certainly most talkback aficionados. Thomas, is Thomas still on board?
I'm here,
Thomas,
yeah.
Oh, Thomas. So you're a journalist, Thomas. Where is this propaganda coming from? How is it being forced on the West and the Third World and everywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said. The skill. I think the thing that is underestimated is Russia's skill at propaganda. And they're not blatant. Obviously, they have their own almost ludicrous, Channel One in Russia and all the Soviet propagandists, but that's not how they approach the West. All of their propaganda is disguised by people like Tucker Carlson, who are credible. They have credibility. And the Russians are not stupid. They know they need to use people like that to get their message across. But I think there's also some sort of a deep, almost a psychology beneath that they exploit. And it's the same psychology that operated during the Cold War, in which there was a huge peace movement that advocated, let's say, moral equivalency. And I think this is based on a misuse of Christian morality, where you believe you should love not only your brother, but also love your enemy, and that this is the way to achieve success. it's basically naive, but it works. And I think it's sort of Christian goodness that gave the Soviet Union a lot longer life than it ever deserved. And today is giving Russia much more freedom than it deserves. The evil that is was represented by the Soviet regime, represented by the Chinese regime, and all communist regimes is just overlooked or justified or talked away or dismissed, as if it's some sort of creation of those regimes as a tool to achieve an objective. It's not. It's the nature of the system itself. And we all know that Putin comes from that background as a former KGB operative. And the Russian regime today, although not ostensibly Soviet or communist, is fascist, but it's built on the communist foundations laid during the Soviet Union. The people running Russia today are the same ones that ran the Soviet Union in the past. And I think they're simply using like this nuclear blackmail trick that they've been using against the West forever is exactly that one. They believe that they can persuade the West to believe them, and they're successful in that. In other words, they're successful in getting us to accept their moral picture of the world, the way they want us to see the world. I think that's what lies behind the propaganda success.
Well, I will state, I had a friend who trained in Moscow in 1983 at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. This was the big Lenin school, 3,500 students, Leningradsky Prospect. And he said, one of the instructors said to him, he said, John, he said, there are many brilliant people in the Soviet Union, but nobody has come up with a weapon as powerful as the peace movement. That is what they see, the peace movement, this surrender of the West, this loving your enemies. Well, I would say if you really, loving your enemies is defeating your enemies. Loving the Russian people is defeating the oppressors of the Russian people. Loving the German people is defeating the Nazis. Loving your neighbor is defeating the criminals that prey upon your neighbor. These peaceniks tend to equate the rulers of Russia with the Russian people. And nothing could be further from the truth, I believe. But Claire, you're a ex-CIA. You've seen a little bit of Russian propaganda in your time. Do you see that it's still happening today? Surely not. We're too sophisticated for that sort of game, are we not?
No, we're not. And I would very much echo Thomas's comments. The propaganda that we're seeing, the information operations coming straight out of the Kremlin, out of the KGB. Yes, still call it the KGB, KGB. The bottom line is that they're good at this stuff, and we're not. And it has to do partially, I think, with what Thomas was getting at, the vulnerability of a Judeo-Christian based society that is not well attuned to evil, to recognizing evil, to confronting evil, not well attuned to recognizing the sophistication, yes, the sophistication of Russian information operations, influence operations, psyops. We just don't generally think like this. Our brains don't work this way because of the Judeo-Christian, basis of our society and of the West in general. But I think the United States is more vulnerable even than Europe, which has had a lot more direct experience with these sorts of things, and I think is therefore maybe at least a little bit better attuned to them. And what I would note too, what really strikes me is the difference between the way the Russian aggression against Ukraine, invasion, slaughter of civilians, bombing of cities, kidnapping of children, how that is perceived or not perceived versus, at least among, I think, most people, maybe not so much our United States administration leadership at the moment, but what happened on October the 7th of last year, 2023, the Shabbat massacre, when Hamas jihadis invaded Israel and slaughtered civilians, raped, mutilated, horrific atrocities. That is somehow viewed, I think, by most Americans, right, and rightly so, in its proper perspective. Aggressors, that is jihadis, Hamas, backed by the regime in Iran, of course, invaded Israel for no reason other than to kill and mutilate and slaughter Jews. But when it comes to Ukraine and an invasion by an aggressor, in this case, Russia, whose leadership, name whom you will, Putin, Lavrov, Medvedev, openly say that their objective is to reestablish something like a Russian empire, Soviet Union, and to obliterate the very nationhood of Ukraine and of its people. I don't necessarily understand why the difference. Again, not necessarily U.S. leadership at the moment, which is quite astray, but rather the people of the United States, why they don't see these two situations as similar, analogous at least. And I think it has to do with Jew hatred, of course, but also there's a support for the Jewish people that outweighs the Jew hatred of the administration. But when it comes to Ukraine, same kind of neo-imperialist, annihilationist, objectives, but a different take or a different understanding. That's something we need to work on, I think.
Well, I think over the last 15 years, the Russians have done a great job of reaching out to American Christians and conservatives, and portraying themselves as the saviors of Christianity against the horrible, secular, degenerate West, of which Ukraine is just a puppet. I know that is influencing the thinking of a lot of American conservatives and Christians. They sincerely believe that Russia's on Christ's side here, which is, some of them have called Putin a lion of Christianity. Well, we all know that's a complete farce, but unfortunately it's been accepted by many American Christians. Now, Victor, you wanted to make the point, which I think is extremely important, that without Ukraine breaking free of the Soviet Union and establishing its own nationhood, that America would be much weaker, that Ukraine helped to make America great again. Can you elaborate on that point, please?
Yeah, sure. If we have time, I wanted to revert as well, perhaps on some of these issues about propaganda and our susceptibility to it. But as to your question, Trevor, very simply, if we know and remember our history, and we do not, and that is a huge reason for a lot of the problems. We were falling behind the Soviet Union in the nuclear capability area in the 80s. And the future trajectory did not look good for us at all. Never mind the economic route within the Soviet Union. We were moving in a direction that could have led easily enough to another Cuban Missile Crisis, who knows where, under what circumstances, what part of the world. But that possibility was there. And indeed, the Soviet Union fell apart, and we, quote unquote, won the Cold War because it did fall apart, right? When you read any kind of text, when you listen to a speech, and people will use the phrase, well, when the Cold War ended. Well, when did it end? It ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. And the dagger in the heart, so to speak, was Ukraine's renewal of its independence in 1991. We were number one. What happened since then? Unfortunately, we repeated our thinking or our lack of a thought process vis-a-vis Ukraine all over again and the way we were treating Ukraine and Russia prior to that. Ukraine was the linchpin for the creation of the Soviet Union. Their control of Ukraine was pivotal to maintaining the ongoing viability of the Soviet Union for many reasons. And consequently, if you're talking about a revanche, an attempt to recast it and rebuild it, or I should say not recast, but rebuild, then it's purely logical that Ukraine would be the target again. What did we do? Instead of establishing a parallel to a Marshall Plan for Ukraine and the other non-Russian republics, and to secure their democracy and their independence and their defense from Russia, we did the opposite. We stripped Ukraine of its nuclear arsenal. We did that with much of their conventional weaponry. Bad enough that that was done, but we insisted that it be turned over to Russia instead of just being destroyed. And we did our best to maintain and to solidify Russia again, as we did in the 1920s and the 1930s. That failed. And guess what? We did the same thing with China. We withdrew recognition in 1979 and put China on its feet, believing, I think fraudulently, I think it was a knowing kind of realization, but we moved forward anyway, thinking that, well, trade and economic benefit is going, let's be friends with China, let's be friends with Moscow. It was tried again with China. That didn't work. Look where we are right now. Well, we did that again with Russia in the 1990s. Bill Clinton considered Yeltsin to be another Abraham Lincoln. All of that was a disaster. It was just a disaster. I don't know whether I mentioned in maybe the first talk that our group had, but I remember very distinctly in December of 2004, writing an extended piece to Condoleezza Rice, who was scheduled to be the Secretary of State, and explaining her that her embrace of Putin was a massive mistake, and he would invade and occupy Ukraine, and how we dealt with that would either recoup our global credibility or it would bury it even further. And that's where we are right now. Ukraine is, I think, or should be secured as a democratic outpost in that part of the world vis-a-vis Russia. We were talking about Hamas. Well, we're not restricting, as I said before, Israel from striking outside of its borders. Why are we doing that with Ukraine? Russia is the nuclear state, not Ukraine. Well, fortunately, Israel does have nuclear weapons. So it has that huge benefit that Ukraine does not, thanks to us. And guess where, when Ukraine was under Russian control, guess where the missiles, the nukes were built that were planted in Cuba and led to the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. They were made in Ukraine. Ukraine was manufacturing it had the largest ICBM plant at the time. And that got all flushed on our insistence. So, and I'm not even talking about resources. I'm not talking about agriculture, Ukraine feeding much of the Middle East and Africa. The maritime law, the law of the seas, and the implications of that. So it's an opportunity, which I dare say, I don't think it's going to be repeated. It's an opportunity for us to recoup our deterrence credibility, secure our allies. And we have a tough road to hoe. I mean, the retreat, the debacle in Afghanistan was horrific. We had the debacle historically in Vietnam. We had it again in Afghanistan. We have it in the Middle East. How do we explain that the first interim security guidelines promulgated by the Biden administration after his inauguration not once mentioned Ukraine, if at the same time we're beating our chest about the so-called rules-based international order? How do you reconcile the two? How do you reconcile the fact that the Minsk Accords, so-called Minsk Accords, were supported by us officially, which would basically throw national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine out the window? There is too much hypocrisy out there, much of which has never been learned or has been forgotten, that has to be redeemed, it has to be recouped. And that is my big concern, that I'm not seeing it right now.
Yeah. Well, look, I think I would like, if everybody will stay and just, I'd like to give another segment to each person. Look, we may have a different president later on this year, maybe not, maybe we will. If we do, what should be the conservative response? What should the Republicans be saying? What should a future president be saying to encourage Ukraine in the interim and to actually get this war over in Ukraine's favor? What conservatives and what is the message that Republicans and conservatives should be pushing to end this war in Ukraine's favor and our favor? Start with you, Lauren.
We need to work together and be more united. And I think we can use the Ukrainian people as an example of that. And we're not locking arms and being united. We need to have more conversations and the right conversations. We need to realize that, this is all a situational environment. The upcoming election, the propaganda that's happening, and I believe that what the Republicans need to do is maybe adopt another, a tactic of the left that works really well, and that's holding each other accountable. Have conversations with people that may not agree with you on Ukraine. They're focused on other things. Have the conversation. We need to work together and spread the message of unity and spread the facts and all these things that we know about Ukraine, that if they lose, it's going to be a disaster for the world. For me, it's really that simple.
Because I think most American conservatives, as Victor said, see this as a real estate dispute, and no great significance beyond that. But as the panelists have here today said, if Ukraine loses, this is going to be a disaster. This is going to be potential major war in Europe, potential World War III, with us at a huge disadvantage. What say you, Jeff?
Well, I think the danger in having a new president is he's going to pull out the old saw of engagement and say, well, I can, talk to them. And I want to quote from U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, who was Woodrow Wilson's last Secretary of State. And in 1920, he made a statement about our relations with Moscow. And he said, you cannot have engagement with Moscow or governments like it. He said, the monarchies formed a coalition surrounding Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong statement. He said, the monarchies formed around revolutionary France because they understood a similar situation was underway. But what Colby said was that you basically have to have no intercourse with a country like this. And I think that we could bring this conflict to a halt if we threaten to break all relations with Russia, to set the example, to encourage our allies and all the other countries to break relations with Russia and any country giving military aid to Russia. We already talked about, I don't think we have very good relations with, do we have official relations with North Korea? I don't think we do. But we have relations with China. And if we threaten China, I mean, what do we sanction 20 Chinese companies? There's more than 20 Chinese companies helping Russia right now. So if we started to put that kind of pressure on Russia and China, I think the war would come to an end. Or at least we'd find out exactly where we really stand with those countries.
So, Victor, are you still there?
Yes.
Can't, yeah. No, no. So Victor, what? I'll go to Thomas after you, then Claire. What do you think? What is the messaging we should be putting out there? Conservatives putting out there? How should a change of government be different that would help Ukraine?
How should a change of government be different?
Well, a new government coming in. What is a different tack that could be taken that would help Ukraine?
I don't intend to sound facetious, but if I was on a talk show and I got a call, I would ask the caller to go into his kitchen and see if he could find a frying pan made in Russia. And he won't. There isn't a damn thing that we are dependent on as far as Russia is concerned compared to China. You need a prescription renewal, go down to your local CVS. What happens if they don't have the meds because China cut us off? So our dependency on Russia is nil. The population of Russia is less than half the United States. Chinese population is 10 times greater. So this does not militate in favor of, well, let's forget about Russia and focus on China. It's the other way around. It's leverage that we're not using and we don't understand it. If we don't secure Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, there's not a snowball's chance we're going to be able to do it vis-a-vis China. It ain't going to happen. If we are being intimidated by nuclear blackmail by Russia, why wouldn't we be intimidated by nuclear blackmail by China? I don't think, I know, it's not a question of thinking. I know that there is no way that we are going to re-educate the populace. It's not going to happen. It's too late, and there's too much baggage there, and there's too much penetration of Russian disinformation, and there is too much money sloshing around, including money accepted by our representatives on the Hill, that we're going to have to fight against. And you can't do that. I think what we have to do is look at the one thing that it seems like the American opponents of Ukraine aid are focusing on, which is China, and take that and demonstrate how, in fact, number one, we were wrong about China way back when, right? So why aren't we as wrong about Russia now unless we support Ukraine to the hilt? I think that's the kind of turnaround and that's the kind of leverage we have to use in the argumentation. And the bottom line is weaponry. You cannot fight a war by tying Ukraine's hands. And if people want to know again of what's going to happen if things go south, I'll tell you what's going to happen. There's going to be a massive genocide of Ukrainians in the millions. And what happens then? We said never again after World War II. Well, we're halfway there already.
Yep. Okay, Thomas, you're still there, I'm sure.
Yes, I am.
Thomas. Yeah, well, so what needs to change? How can we help Ukraine win? What policies needs to change? What messaging needs to change from either this government or the next government?
Well, the outcome of whatever change it is that the next government should be absolutely committed to victory for Ukraine in Ukraine. That's absolutely unequivocal. It changes everything. If you're determined to win, you do all the things people are suggesting to win. You cut off Russia, you isolate China, you put pressure on China, all the different pressure points. But the starting point has to be an absolute determination to win. I think we can look a bit to Reagan and his philosophy that broke with containment and détente. Reagan had a good joke, as he had about most things, about détente. He says the relationship a farmer has with his turkey until Thanksgiving. So he didn't accept that approach, and he had a very simple foreign policy: we win, they lose. That's the right foreign policy, because he saw the battle as a moral battle, as the evil empire was the enemy and had to be defeated. You could not compromise with it. And, push came to shove in Iceland when he rejected Gorbachev's solution. That's what we need. And I think we need to understand America's role in the world, because if America doesn't get straight on this, we can't really expect the rest of Europe and the world to follow, to lead. And I think that is a moral issue. I think America is a providential country. And as Reagan again said in 1988, America was blessed not only for itself, but for the world. And Putin's is an evil regime. It's no longer ostensibly communist, as I mentioned, but it's fascist. The difference being that it embraces religion and manipulates it to its own benefit, which is what Hitler did and all the fascists always did. That's the only difference. So we have to recognize that Putin is the new Hitler.
Okay, so Claire, what do you believe has to happen in the conservative movement with the existing government and a future government? There are some who worry that Trump will, naively try and make a deal with Putin and sell Ukraine down the river to get a bit of peace for a month or 2 months or whatever. What do you see? What messaging we use to make sure a new government goes in a suitable direction?
Well, I think that the most important thing that can possibly happen is a change in understanding the foundations of this conflict. Where does this come from? And this is bigger than just Russia and Ukraine. Worldwide, what we're seeing right now, and have seen in the past, it's not unique to our time, but what we're seeing is the conflict between empire and sovereign nation state. The conflict between the push to globalization and the sovereignty of the independent nation state. I mean, this goes back centuries, of course, but it's not just Russia versus Ukraine. It is the whole system of an empire, of tyranny, of the power of a central government authority to dominate and to invade and rampage as it will against independent nation states, and the very concept of individual liberty and national sovereignty. It doesn't matter, which tyranny we're talking about. Islam, of course, is a 1400-year-old tyranny that seeks to subjugate the entire world beneath it. That is what's happening between Hamas, Iran, and Israel. If you think about Iran, China, and Russia, not a one of them is actually a nation state per se. Each one of those is an empire of conquered peoples. You think about China, the Mongols, the Manchurians, the Cantonese, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong. Every one of these is a captive, conquered people incorporated by force into an empire. It's the same thing in Russia. I don't know how many nations and individual, peoples have been conquered over the centuries. And what Putin and his Kremlin is doing right now is a continuation of that. It's the mindset of Russian rulers. It is empirical. It is tyrannical. So I would want our future government here in the United States, and hopefully that will be a different one, a changed one than we have now. I would hope that they would get the right kind of advisors around them, and I don't know that that's the case so far, but hope that they might, that would explain and understand, help that new incoming team, let's say, if that is to be, to understand that Ukrainians fight on the front lines of sovereign nationhood, of individual liberty versus tyranny, versus the authority of an expansionist, aggressive, empirical state, which is Russia, which is Islam, which is China, all the above. So that kind of advice has got to be gotten through, I hope now in the lead up period to the election here in the United States, November 5th. But now's the time to get that messaging through to those people who may well staff a future administration.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to end with just a quick 1 minute from each panelist. Given the right support, given a strategic cutoff from, given the right pressure on Russia, the right pressure on China, and the right support from America, is it realistic that Ukraine could regain its borders, take back Crimea, and decisively defeat Russia? Is that realistic? I'll start with Lauren. Do you think it's a possibility?
Yes. The Ukrainians are smart enough, they're capable enough, they have the will, and they have the determination with the right support. They need weapons.
Okay, Jeff, what do you think? Do you think it's pie in the sky, or do you think it's realistic that they could win this?
It's realistic if the United States has the right strategic, game plan. And it has to be comprehensive, and it has to be diplomatic, and it has to involve our allies, and it has to involve the right economic policies.
Okay. So, Thomas, what do you think?
Absolutely.
Well, that's pretty straightforward. Okay. So Claire, what do you think? With the right backing and the right policies, is it feasible for Ukraine to overcome Russia in this conflict?
Yeah, I absolutely do believe that. I agree with our prior panelists and their affirmation of that as well. And I would say that, like Bibi Netanyahu in a recent statement said, whether the United States continues to provide Israel with the weapons that it needs or not, Israel will fight, what did he say? Down to its fingernails, right? That's exactly what the Ukrainians will do. They will never give up, and we should not give up on them.
Yeah, that attitude is why I started supporting Israel after the 6-Day War when I was 9 years old.
Mhm.
I thought, wow, look at what they can do. Look how they stand up for themselves. So, Victor, you're very much a realist. You're boots on the ground. You know the situation. Given, because I think we all acknowledge that a large part of the battle was going to be fought within American public opinion.
Yeah.
This is going to be a huge part of it, and this is where we have a role to play. So, Victor, given the right change in American public opinion and the right change in American leadership, is it realistic that Ukraine can recover its borders and retake Crimea and rejoin and join NATO to be safe for a very long time?
Sure, and it's reciprocal as well, because NATO probably needs Ukraine more than Ukraine needs NATO. All right, so let me just say that in terms of the future trajectory. But unwittingly, in your question, Trevor, you touched upon a dominant subliminal, actually, it's actually being articulated, theme and success of Russian disinformation. And listen to the illogic that's being swallowed by everybody or a lot of people. Ukraine cannot win, therefore we will not help Ukraine. Think about the argument. You are, not you, but generally, that argument then supposes and uses as an excuse not to provide aid a situation, namely failure and defeat, that aid is intended to prevent. Does everybody see the perversity of the argument and the excuse? Well, Ukrainians can't win, therefore we're not going to help them, right? Well, the purpose of the help is to make sure that they win. You can't argue logically that, well, they won't win and therefore we're not going to help you. And yet, that is accepted hook, line, and sinker almost across the board. Nobody ever questions it. It is an automaton, a baboon mouthing the trainer. And that comes straight out of Russia. That is one of the dominant themes. China's more important, forget about Russia. Ukrainians can't win, and oh, Zelensky has 2, 3 yachts and a dozen concubines on each yacht. That is just fiction. And it says a lot about our susceptibility, our ignorance, and our inability to learn from our own experience in order to divine reality from fiction. So the bottom line, one word, yes.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, Victor. I think you've laid it out very well there, that the greatest danger we have is defeatism, is this attitude that we accept the Russian defeatist ideas, make them become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then it just keeps on going again. Then we can't defend Europe. If Europe's lost, we can't defend Europe. Well, we can't defend Latin America. Latin America's lost. Well, we can't defend Canada. It's just going to go on and on and on. It was the logic that led up to World War II, peace in our time. We can't challenge Hitler. We can't escalate the war. We know that that's untrue. We know we've got to change that narrative, and that's our mission. So I want to thank you all for participating. We'll have to do this again very soon. It's a very much a moving thing. So I want to thank you, Victor. I want to thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much, Lauren. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Claire. Your expertise is valuable. And I think we all agree that yes, Ukraine can win, but that depends on what American conservatives do and how much we can change American opinion and ensure the government moves in the right direction. I think that's a fair summation of tonight.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. And thanks, Lauren, for putting this all together. And we'll see you all again soon. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you
good day.
all.